Welcome to the Business Resilience Podcast with valuable expert tips and exciting insights into the world of emergency and crisis management by and for professionals.
Hello everyone, my name is Dennis Martin and I run the Resilience and Compliance Consultancy Praetorion in London, and I'll be your host for this episode. My guest today is again Professor Angela Clendenin. Dr. Clendenin is a professor of epidemiology and biostatics at Texas A&M University and teaches emergency management in public health, disaster epidemiology, and global health systems. She's published a large number of papers on crisis management and crisis communication, including credibility and trust in disaster and emergency communication. Hello, Angela. Nice to have you here again.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me back. I enjoy this.
So, Angela, last time we spoke, we talked a lot about crisis management, how this crisis has affected businesses, countries, and the different responses. We also talked about crisis communication and how crucial that is to dealing with this kind of emergencies and any kind of emergency, really. In your view, what's the main point about crisis communication that we need to get right, be it on a country level or on a business level?
So I think we've really experienced a paradigm shift when we think about how we approach crisis communication as communicators. It used to be just enough to put your message out and push it out, and then it was up to the public, your audience, to take that information and determine what to do with it. But with the advent of social media, we really have to think about what is our intent with crisis communication. We have to be much more intentional with our message and with our delivery. And it really is about initiating that conversation, providing people information on a platform that they value, but also at the same time to provide actionable information. Because at the end of the day, crisis communication is about empowering people to act. And we need them to act in a way that gets us back operationally, if you want to speak in a business sense, or gets them out of harm's way, if we're thinking about the physical sense. And so crisis communication is more than just communicating. It really is intentional, and it has very specific objectives. And we really have to think through how we're engaging our audience.
So basically, we need to think about what do we want people to do and to take away from this, and then derive our messaging from that?
Absolutely. You know, for instance, if you know that you frequently are having to communicate about flooding and you want people to evacuate, you could drive through the streets and blast a horn and tell people the water's rising, you need to evacuate. And quite a few people will, but there will be some who want to see the water rising before they evacuate. Or they want to talk to their neighbors and say, are you leaving? Because I know if I leave, I'm worried about someone coming in and taking my stuff. So I don't want to leave. So they have this ability to measure their actions against people that they value, their perspectives and their opinions. So they bounce ideas off of family, friends, neighbors. They do that through social media, through conversation. So we really have to make sure that everybody's hearing the same message and that they understand it. And that really does take thought about what are we asking people to do? What are their barriers to doing that? And how can we help them overcome those barriers?
Is there any kind of best practice or ideas in how we could do that appropriately and properly? Or is this really very unique to each situation and we really need to start from scratch every time?
I think there are probably some basic principles that are, I guess, transcendent across different scenarios. Things like engaging your community and really knowing your community. What is that vibe that your particular community gives off? Is it common for people to gather in large, plazas and talk and share? Is it a community that largely relies on a more localized newspaper? Or is it a fairly young community where they've already moved past Facebook and they're already into Instagram, Snapchat, whatever else is the social medium of the day? So the important thing to realize, too, is in the planning, another commonality is you cannot just pick one vehicle. you're going to have to pick the traditional vehicles that you've used in communication in the past, but you also need to engage in the newer platforms using the newer technology, and that can be very labor intensive because, as I've mentioned, previously, that social media is not just about posting messages. It's really about engagement and conversation. And so that means having somebody there facilitating conversation when there's a disaster and when there's not. The minute you turn off the conversation, they leave.
Is that a sort of call for more devolved communication? As in, does it make sense for whether it's the federal government or state governments to say, this is the message we need to communicate, and then go to local councils or other more local units and say, this is how you need, or this is what you need to communicate, and how you communicate it really is up to you because you know the situation best. I think that the same thing would work for companies. Would it make sense to sort of say, well, this is our international headquarters view, and now, dear countries, think about how you need to translate that into your specific country in a way that works for you in your country, in your department, or however far you want to break that down? Or is that just getting too complicated?
No, I don't think it's too complicated at all. And, to keep it kind of focused in the business world, if you have an international headquarters in one country, they may not be impacted by a disaster that hits maybe one of their major plants or their major operational hubs in another country. But I do think that the international headquarters has a role in working through the messaging with the impacted entity and then letting them understand the environment they work in for the best dissemination process. The message needs to be strong and it needs to be cohesive. So if you have a British Petroleum in England and then you have a British Petroleum rig in the Gulf of Mexico and something happens to that rig, there's going to be a local response, and you're dealing with local cultures and local communities that are impacted. So they need to be at the forefront of the communication and responding, but the messaging needs to be consistent with what is coming out of the international headquarters. There needs to be that two-way conversation to come out with a unified front. And that's the way that businesses can maintain sort of that cohesive presence, and it just makes their message that much stronger.
What I've seen in businesses, which I've quite liked, at least in some businesses, is that they created a, let's just call it emergency management community of interest, and they got what they called bridgeheads from all sorts of departments and countries into that group, and they would assemble them once every quarter and brief them on what's going on in emergency management. And these bridgeheads would then be the people that would disseminate the messages into their local communities and into their local departments to make sure that the message didn't come from someone in corporate, but it came from that colleague that they all knew and hopefully liked. So it had a more local feel to the messaging, and it also meant that you could actually take account of what was going on the ground. And in reverse, in these steering committees, people from the front lines basically could say, actually, what you're saying here and your plan just doesn't work, because in my community, or in my department, things work differently. Is that a useful template for local communities as well that we could think about, that we sort of have a maybe citywide or county-wide emergency board, and we get some people, representatives from business associations or whatever, in to sort of brief them and to get them to be the spokespeople on the ground?
Oh, absolutely. Emergency management from historically has always been something that has been relegated to a small group of people. And particularly in Texas and the United States, they are former military, law enforcement, firefighter types. And they would come up with the plan and they executed the plan. But what we're finding over time is that we have stakeholders, people who have a vested interest in a community's ability to respond. And that can be business leaders, that can be the religious and faith community, that can be the education system. And so there really is a big push to be inclusive in your planning process and getting people from all of the various corners of the community to come together to develop the plan. And when you do that, you're actually building that scaffolding for communication, Because if you have everybody in the same room talking and learning from each other and about each other's unique situations and unique needs, then you have a more comprehensive plan. And when it's implemented, then you have the conduit to get the temperature, kind of read the room, if you will, in the community and understand how it's responding, and you can adjust accordingly.
And I think that's actually possibly a way of getting communities to trust what you're doing, that, you get them involved from day one, you get them involved in the groundwork and in the preparations.
Oh, of course. An interesting sort of side note that also equally important is the designation of that spokesperson. Whoever is going to be the person who is delivering the message. It's one thing to have all of the engagement and to be able to have that conduit and to develop strong messages, but the person delivering the message is equally critical. And in the course of my research, I came across a large body of literature on trust. And one of the key things that has stuck with me is that if we were in a room with a group of people we were familiar with, and a stranger walks into that room, we make a decision about whether that person is trustworthy or not in 100 milliseconds. And that is part of our DNA. It's part of our fight or flight response. So it's a biological reaction that we can make that judgment that quickly. And a lot of people's ability to trust after that point goes to almost a level of familiarity. So what is the type of interaction that this spokesperson has had with the community? And as an example of an explanation, in my research, I was in a community, and you would think that the mayor, who is an elected official of this particular community, would be seen as trustworthy. But he wasn't, because he doesn't even live in the community that he was the mayor of. And so by far and large, he would not be a good person to be a spokesperson in the event that a disaster hit that community. The county judge, who is the lead emergency manager for that county, is highly respected. So he would be somebody you would want to put up as a spokesperson. So again, having that kind of engagement with stakeholders at the front end helps you identify the people who are trusted in that community that can deliver that message more efficiently and effectively.
I think that's spot on, and I completely agree. I think one of the challenges is that if you have a mayor in a city, or prime minister or president of a country, and you tell them that, people don't trust you and let this person do the communication instead, they might not actually like that very much. So I think that could be a challenge to this. Is that something we could overcome, or we must overcome?
I think it's something that we need to be working on. And I am almost certain that if you were to go digging into how we've discussed in the past about the after action reviews for a number of disasters, how the number one gap that needs to be fixed is communication. I am almost certain that if we were to dig in and start researching what is really at the core that makes this so problematic, that designation of the right spokesperson is going to be key into why there are communication failures. The wrong people are in the wrong place to say the wrong thing. And so it's a multifaceted aspect of crisis response, and it is so critical to get communication right.
Are there any core rules in terms of how to get communication right? As in, if you're designated a spokesperson by chance, what sort of are the core principles of how you should communicate, and how you especially make sure that you don't lose the trust of the community that you communicate to?
So some of the core principles of good crisis communication is communicate often, set a schedule for when you will be able to release more information, and do it as you say you will, and be transparent. Now, I know that in the corporate world and in a lot of disciplines, there are times when you can't just share everything. There are some things that there's still a high degree of uncertainty. There are certain, corporate policies and things that it's not something that you could put in the public purview. But be as transparent as you possibly can. And if you don't know the answer, it's okay to admit you don't have all the answers, but let them know you're working on it. And as soon as you get the answers, you'll get back to them. It's that openness and that frequent communication that helps establish trust, and making sure that everything you say all the time is something that could be said in the public. Because when you are a spokesperson, everything you say is free game. And so it can come out and it can be taken out of context. And that's where people run into a lot of problems. The other good core rule is to keep it short and simple, and to think in terms of sound bites. Don't start rambling and telling a bunch of information at one time, because people will get confused and they will get mixed messages, because it just creates a big jumble of words that's open to interpretation. So being clear and concise and frequent are some of the three things that a person can do to build credibility.
I think that's something that we're seeing every day, at least in the UK here, is that government is saying they want to communicate more clearly and make the rules clear to everyone. And they've just come out with new COVID-related rules. And there are so many open questions that it makes it almost harder to follow the rules than what they were before. And it always takes some time to sort of get to what the actual messaging now is. I remember they switched from the initial standard stay home and protect the NHS to something like stay alert, or something which no one really knew what that meant. So I think, clearly communicating, this is what you must do, and here are different scenarios and what you need to do in these different scenarios. That's really important. But what really struck me when I looked at communication in this crisis and sort of information available in this crisis was that in Germany, there were a couple of podcasts by professors for virology, epidemiology, and they were extremely popular, even though they actually went into detail. And one of the professors went into enormous detail, sort of medical detail, explaining how, angiotensin converting enzyme receptors work and why they're relevant for COVID. And people really liked that kind of information. Is that something that you've seen in the US or in other countries, that sort of people have been interested and actually been provided with a really in-depth level of knowledge about what we're actually talking, or what we're actually seeing there and what we're actually fighting?
I think the information is there. There are places that you can go here in the United States and find similar podcasts. There are places you can go and find information that's scientific, that is translated really well for the layman and in very simple language. So you're still getting the same information, but in a way that's a little more digestible. But I do think we suffer from information overload here in the United States. And so I think people aren't always as willing to commit to something that's lengthy and maybe sometimes a little bit difficult to digest and to understand for the sake of knowing. And so that does create a challenge.
I think one of the big challenges, just looking at this COVID crisis, is that we're dealing with something that we don't see. And I'm always surprised to see huge protest marches, whether in London or in Germany, about the COVID hoax and how this is not a thing, how we're being mind controlled, and how masks are sort of the devil's tool that's trying to turn us all into slaves. Where does this kind of thing come from? How can we sort of combat that?
So when we were talking about the core principles behind good crisis communication, that's only one half of the battle. You're communicating to a public, and they have to decide what they are going to do with that information. And they can believe it, they cannot believe it. But you're right, with the pandemic, this is something that nobody has any experience with. And it's making people interact with the scientific community. And going all the way back historically, the public has had a hard time engaging with the scientific community, with the academic community, and trying to understand for the purpose of improvement, for risk reduction, for protective behaviors. They tend to listen to other disciplines much higher. Interestingly enough, going back to my research, I had little cards made that look like trading cards, and they had different occupations on them. And on the back, it had some information about that occupation. And I asked people, the participants in my study, to sort the cards from most trustworthy source to least trustworthy source. And most trustworthy typically ended up being people like firefighters, policemen, people in the community that at that community level that tended to work in service industries like public health or medicine. But researcher was way down at the bottom. Media and politicians kind of switched places in the middle, and military was kind of at the bottom. And I know that's because here in the United States, again, we're about civil liberties and not wanting the government to come in and tell us what to do. But it was interesting because what that told me is that from a scientific evidence base, the people that are generating that information are not seen as trustworthy sources. So I think that's where you start seeing things like the anti-vax movement. You start seeing things like climate deniers. You start seeing things like flat earthers. And so when you have those types of people, and they are absolutely entitled to their opinions and their communities of interest. But when we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're doing everything we can based on historical action that works to try to stop the spread of this disease, and we're having to fight against faith and science, it's
I mean, I've had a thought last week about who do we actually still trust? Because from my point of view, at least in the past few months, we've seen, and years in some cases, we've seen certain circles criticizing the press and eroding trust in the press because they're just spreading lies, is what's being said. Other people mistrusting government because they believe that government is corrupt or run by idiots or whatever. Other people are starting to erode trust in the police and other institutions because we've seen them misbehave and do things that didn't really portray them in a very favorable light. Who do we still trust? Are there any constants?
That's a really good point. When I did my research, law enforcement scored really high, as did firefighters. I do think firefighters and those types of first responders still are highly trustworthy. I do see trust in law enforcement declining for many reasons here in the United States. But I think when you look at what I call the service-oriented occupations, nurses, some doctors, people that work in the local health department, teachers. So those types of occupations tend to be highly respected. And, they can be people that would be a great foundation for communication.
So I think that brings us back to what we talked about earlier. Get people involved in the communities that people know and people trust. Therefore, rather than having some anonymous person on TV and telling them about what to do.
Absolutely. Again, people don't like outsiders. The perception is that the further removed the spokesperson is from that local event, the less likely they are able to understand the impact on that localized event, on that community. And so if they don't understand how that event impacted that community, why are we going to listen to what they tell us to do? And so that can absolutely translate into that commercial or business type of setting. When you start thinking about the locations of businesses and their headquarters, particularly if they're large multinational or even national organizations with multiple sites, that localized site really should be taking the lead in the communication, because the people that live in that community work there. They have a vested interest in that company being there. Doesn't mean they can't be supported from the large national headquarters. And the large national or multinational headquarters should have a presence and something to say, but it really should be about focusing on that local impact by people who understand it.
So we're almost at the end of this episode. What can we sum up? What can companies do? What should companies do to prepare? What are some of the pitfalls that we're seeing in communicating in a crisis, whether it's COVID or any crisis that we may see in the future?
So I really think we hit on some of the high points about being very intentional with your communication and the importance of including stakeholders in your planning process, even if it's planning communication or testing your communication processes. One of the things that, is a really important pitfall that you need to avoid is the idea of groupthink. When you do have a dynamic spokesperson or a dynamic leader that is guiding your emergency management operation, it's real easy for people to fall in and just follow, and you get groupthink, and bad things happen when people don't question the direction that we're going. So really, an effective leader is not somebody with a strong personality. They do have to have a very visible personality. They can't be exactly a wallflower or somebody who hides in the shadows. But at the same time, they need to be a facilitator, not somebody who is authoritarian that says this is the way it's going to be unquestionably, because then people are afraid to question and you end up in that groupthink. A great emergency manager for a company understands the value of crisis communication and is a facilitator and brings the appropriate stakeholders to the table. He facilitates, or she facilitates, that discussion and makes sure everybody's voice is heard, that everybody agrees on the appropriate direction, even if it does mean that the emergency leadership needs to guide that a little bit more. But when you have that effective many voices, one message approach, then you can be much more intentional with your crisis communication, and you can be much more relevant to the audiences that you're trying to communicate with.
Angela, thank you very much. That was extremely interesting. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast again.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast and visit us on social media. See you next time.